clock on the wall of the intensive care unit doesn't tick, it hums. It's a low-frequency vibration that crawls under your skin and stays there, a constant reminder that time here is measured in drops of an IV bag and the rhythmic wheeze of a ventilator. It was 2:14 a.m. In the world of the living, that's the dead of night. In my world, it was the middle of the afternoon. I stood at the nurse's station, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of angry hornets. I was staring at a computer screen, charting the fluid output of a man in room 302 who didn't even know his own name anymore. To anyone watching the security feed, I was just a silhouette in baggy navy blue scrubs. I was the guy you walk past in the cafeteria and forget 5 seconds later. I was Nurse Miller, the quiet one, the one who worked the double shifts nobody wanted, the one who never joined the others for happy hour. But under those scrubs, my skin was a map of places I wasn't supposed to have been. There's a jagged line of scar tissue on my left shoulder from a piece of shrapnel in the Korangal Valley. There's a puckered mark on my ribs from a night in a village near the border of Pakistan that officially never happened. I spent 10 years as an army ranger. I spent a decade learning how to move through the dark, how to breathe through the adrenaline, and how to turn anything in my environment into a weapon of necessity. When I took the uniform off for the last time, I didn't just leave the military. I tried to lobotomize that part of my brain. I wanted a life where the only blood I saw was in a sterile vial, and the only screams I heard were from patients coming out of anesthesia. I thought I had succeeded. I had everyone fooled. I even had myself fooled. "Miller, you okay?" It was Sarah, the charge nurse. She was 24, fueled by iced coffee and a misplaced sense of optimism. She looked at me with that pitying expression people give to quiet men. She thought I was just tired. She thought I was just another burnt-out healthcare worker grinding through the American nightmare of 12-hour shifts. "I'm fine, Sarah," I said. My voice was flat, practiced. "Just making sure 302's potassium is stable." "You're always so still," she laughed, leaning against the desk. "It's creepy. It's like you're waiting for something to explode." I didn't tell her that when you've spent 1,000 nights waiting for an IED to flip your Humvee into a ditch, stillness is the only way you know how to survive. I didn't tell her that even now, my eyes were subconsciously scanning the exits, noting that the floor was slick near the elevators and that the fire extinguisher behind her left shoulder could be used to fracture a human skull if the pin was pulled. I just smiled, a fake, practiced stretching of the lips, and went back to my charting. Then the air changed. If you've been in combat, you know what I'm talking about. It's not a sound. It's a shift in the barometric pressure of the room. The hospital's automatic front doors hissed open down in the lobby. Normally, the sound is muffled by 2 floors of concrete, but tonight it felt like a thunderclap. I heard the heavy, uneven footfalls, not the squeak of a nurse's sneaker or the rolling chime of a gurney. These were heavy boots, hard soles, the sound of someone who wasn't trying to be quiet because they didn't think anyone could stop them. I looked up. The hallway was empty, but the shadows at the end of the corridor seemed to warp. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her smile faltering. I didn't answer. My hand moved instinctively to my waist, reaching for a sidearm that hadn't been there in 3 years. My fingers gripped thin air. My heart rate stayed at a cool 62 beats per minute, but the nurse persona was already beginning to fracture. Then came the scream. It wasn't a "I'm in pain" scream. It was the sound of a human being looking directly into the mouth of a shark. It came from the ER intake just below us. A second later, a loud, metallic clack-clack echoed up the elevator shaft. Most people in that hospital heard a noise. I heard a Remington 870 being cycled. I heard a round being chambered. I heard the sound of my past coming to collect its debt. "Sarah," I said, my voice dropping an octave. The softness was gone. It was the voice of a staff sergeant commanding a squad. "Get behind the desk, now." "What, Miller? You're scaring me." "Down now, lock the med room. Don't come out until I say a code word." "What code word?" she whispered, her face turning the color of the hospital sheets. "You won't need one if you just stay put," I lied. The elevator bell chimed. The doors slid open. A man stepped out, He was wearing a grease-stained Carhartt jacket, his face a mask of sweating, twitching desperation. In his hands was a sawed-off shotgun, the barrel pointed directly at the ceiling. He looked like a man who had lost everything and decided that the rest of the world should lose it with him. "Nobody move," he roared. The sound of his voice triggered something deep in my brain. The night nurse died in that moment. The Army Ranger stood up. I felt the familiar rush of ice water through my veins. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel anger. I felt a cold, clinical sense of mission. He didn't see me as a threat. Why would he? I was just a guy in blue scrubs holding a clipboard. He thought he was the apex predator in this room. He was wrong. He had just walked into the one ward in the entire United States, guarded by a ghost who had been trained by the finest instructors at Fort Benning to turn a moment of chaos into a masterpiece of violence. He leveled the shotgun at the nurse's station, the barrel shaking. "Where's the oxy? Where's the heavy stuff? Give it to me or I start clearing rooms." I stepped out from behind the desk. I didn't rush him. I didn't yell. I walked toward him with a slow, rhythmic pace, my hands held open and visible at my chest. "Hey man," I said, my voice as smooth as glass. "You're in the wrong place for the pharmacy, but I can help you." He swung the shotgun toward my chest. The black hole of the barrel looked like an entrance to a tomb. "Back off. I'll blow you open, nurse. I swear to God." I kept walking, 1 foot in front of the other. I was measuring the distance, 10 feet, 8 feet. I could see the sweat on his upper lip. I could see that his finger was inside the trigger guard, a rookie mistake, but a deadly one. "You're shaking," I told him, my voice devoid of emotion. "That's the adrenaline. Your vision is narrowing. You're losing your peripherals. In about 10 seconds, you're going to realize that there are 6 different ways I can take that gun away from you before your brain can tell your finger to squeeze." He blinked, confused. This wasn't the reaction he wanted. He wanted screams. He wanted begging. He didn't want a lecture on combat physiology from a guy who looked like he should be checking a blood pressure cuff. "Who the hell are you?" he hissed. I smiled, and for the first time in 5 years, the smile was real. It was the smile of a wolf that had finally been allowed to stop pretending he was a sheep. "I'm the guy who's going to make sure you never walk out of this hallway," I said. And then the world exploded. The gunman flinched. It was a micro-expression, a tiny twitch of the eyelid that told me he wasn't a professional. A professional doesn't hesitate when a target starts talking back. A professional doesn't look for validation in the eyes of his victim. But this guy, he was drowning. He was a man who had reached the end of his rope and decided to tie a noose for everyone else. But as he stared at me, trying to figure out why a night nurse was speaking to him in the tone of a high-ranking officer, my mind was already 3 miles down the road. That's the thing about being an Army Ranger. You don't live in the present. You live in a series of if-then statements. If he moves the barrel an inch to the left, then I drop my center of gravity. If he pulls the trigger now, then the spread of the buckshot at this range will hit the drywall behind me, but the ricochet might catch Sarah. Sarah, I could hear her breathing behind the desk. It was ragged, shallow, the sound of someone whose world had just collapsed. She was the collateral damage I had spent 5 years trying to avoid. I lived a double life, but not the kind you see in spy movies. There were no hidden compartments in my floorboards or encrypted laptops in my closet. My disguise was much more effective because it was boring. I was the guy who brought donuts on Fridays. I was the guy who volunteered to handle the difficult patients, the ones who bit, the ones who spat, the ones who screamed until their lungs gave out. My coworkers thought I was just patient. They didn't realize that after you've survived a 48-hour firefight in a valley where the air is more lead than oxygen, a grumpy patient with a hip fracture is basically a vacation. I had spent years conditioning myself to be soft. I practiced my nurse, gentle, lilting cadence that de-escalates a panicked family member. I learned how to touch people with care, how to hold a hand without crushing it, how to be a vessel for healing instead of a tool for destruction. It was a penance. Every time I cleaned a wound, I was trying to scrub away the memory of the wounds I'd caused. Every time I saved a life, I was trying to balance a cosmic scale that I knew, deep down, would never be even. And yet here I was, the scale was tipping again. You think I'm joking? The gunman screamed. His voice cracked an octave too high. He was losing his grip. I'll kill you. I'll kill everyone here. I just need the pills. I just need it to stop. I know it hurts, I said, stepping even closer. I was now 6 feet away, the danger zone. In the military, we call it the fatal funnel. If he fired now, I was a dead man. But I wasn't a man, I was a calculation. I've seen that look before. I've seen it in men who have lost their brothers. I've seen it in men who have lost their souls. You're looking for a way out, but this hallway isn't it. Shut up, stop talking to me like you know me. He shifted his weight. He was leading with his right foot. He was right-handed. That meant his balance was off-center. If I could get him to turn just 45 degrees to the left, his line of sight would be blocked by the structural pillar next to the elevators. I checked the reflection in the polished linoleum floor. I could see the flickering light of the exit sign behind him. I could see the shadows of the other nurses cowering behind the supply carts further down the hall. They were looking at me like I was a madman. To them, I was committing suicide. They wanted me to beg. They wanted me to do what the hospital training videos said: submit, comply, wait for help. But help was 10 minutes away, and this man was 10 seconds away from a nervous breakdown. You know what's funny? I said, a dry, dark humor bubbling up in my chest. I spent 4 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment. I've jumped out of planes into territory that would make your nightmares look like a Disney movie. I've been shot, stabbed, and blown up. And after all that, I thought the most dangerous thing I'd ever face was a disgruntled patient with a grudge against Medicare. The gunman's eyes widened. The word Ranger hit him like a physical blow. It was a word that carried weight, even in the drug-addled haze of his brain. It suggested a level of violence he wasn't prepared for. You're lying, he hissed, but the barrel of the shotgun lowered just a fraction of an inch. You're just a nurse. Look at you. You're wearing little teddy bears on your badge. I looked down at my badge reel. It was true. A gift from a pediatric patient I'd treated 6 months ago. A tiny, smiling bear holding a heart. The ultimate irony. The bears are for the patients, I said, my voice turning cold. The nurse was officially gone now. The mask had slipped entirely. The training is for you. I felt the shift in the room. The air didn't just feel heavy anymore, it felt electric. It was the moment before the lightning strikes. I could feel the old Miller, the one I'd tried to bury in a shallow grave of nursing textbooks and hospital shifts, climbing back into the driver's seat. He was cold, he was precise, and he was very, very angry that his quiet night had been interrupted. I remembered my sergeant back at Bennying. Miller, he'd say, the moment you stop being afraid of the gun is the moment the gun becomes yours. I wasn't afraid of the gun. I was disgusted by it. I was disgusted that this man had brought this filth into a place of healing. This was my sanctuary. This was where I was supposed to be a good man, and he was forcing me to be the other thing. Put it down, I said. It wasn't a request. It was a psychic command. I poured every ounce of my combat experience, every drop of my Ranger's will into those 3 words. The gunman began to tremble, not just his hands, but his whole body. He was looking at me, but he wasn't seeing a nurse anymore. He was seeing the ghost. He was seeing the man who had survived the valleys of Afghanistan. He was seeing the darkness that lives behind the eyes of people who have seen the end of the world. I can't, he whispered. They'll arrest me. I'm already dead. Not yet, I said, but you're standing on the edge, and I'm the only one who can pull you back, or I can be the one who pushes you over. It's your choice, but decide fast, because my nurse patience just ran out. Behind him, the elevator dinger sounded again. The sound was like a starting pistol. The gunman spun around, startled by the noise. It was the opening I needed. The if-then statement had reached its conclusion. If he turns his back, then I strike. I didn't think, I didn't hesitate, I didn't even breathe. I launched myself across the 6-foot gap. I wasn't Sarah's quiet coworker anymore. I wasn't the guy who brought donuts. I was a 200-pound projectile of muscle and memory, fueled by a decade of war and 5 years of repressed rage. The controversy isn't that I fought back. The controversy is that I liked it. As I closed the distance, The world slowed down into a series of still frames. I saw the grit under his fingernails. I saw the way the light caught the oily surface of the shotgun barrel. I saw the look of pure, unadulterated shock on his face as he realized that the invisible man was currently flying through the air toward his throat. I was no longer hidden. I was no longer a nurse. I was a ranger, and the ward was now my kill zone. The transition from a healer to a weapon is not a slow burn. It is a light switch. One moment you are calculating a dosage of morphine to alleviate pain, and the next, you are calculating the exact amount of force required to crush a windpipe. As I launched myself toward the gunman, the sterile, antiseptic smell of the hospital vanished. In its place was the metallic tang of old adrenaline and the ghostly scent of cordite. I didn't tackle him like a football player. That's sloppy. That's for people who want to end up on the ground rolling around in a 50-50 toss-up. In the 75th, we were taught that the ground is where you go to die if you don't control the descent. I hit him like a precision instrument. My left hand shot out, not for his face, but for the foreststock of the shotgun. I didn't try to pull it away from him, I pushed it. I drove the barrel upward and away from the nurse's station, away from Sarah, away from the patients. The metallic clink of the barrel hitting the ceiling tiles was the only warning he got. My right hand, meanwhile, formed a rigid blade, striking the soft tissue of his throat with enough pressure to steal his breath, but not enough to collapse the trachea, not yet. I still had the nurse in the back of my head, whispering about the paperwork of a homicide. The gunman let out a sound like a punctured tire. His eyes bulged, and for a split second, we were locked in a macabre dance. He was desperate, fueled by a cocktail of chemical withdrawal and raw terror. He tried to pull the trigger. I felt the vibration as the hammer dropped, but the safety was on, or the chamber hadn't fully seated when he'd cycled it in the lobby. That was his one and only stroke of luck that night. If that gun had gone off, the muzzle blast would have deafened us both and likely sent buckshot through the ceiling into the maternity ward upstairs. I didn't give him a second chance to find the trigger. I stepped inside his guard, closing the distance until I could smell the stale tobacco and unwashed skin. This is the part of the story the hospital board would later call excessive. I call it efficient. I drove my forehead into the bridge of his nose. It's a move that doesn't look like much on a grainy security camera, but the sound, the crunch of cartilage, is something you feel in your own teeth. He stumbled back, his hands flying to his face, momentarily forgetting the weapon. But gravity and momentum were already my partners. I hooked my leg behind his calf and drove my shoulder into his chest. We hit the linoleum floor with a sickening thud that echoed down the long, empty corridor of the ICU. The shotgun skittered across the floor, spinning like a compass needle until it came to rest against a stack of clean linens. "Gun," Sarah screamed from behind the desk. It was the first time she'd found her voice, and it was high, shrill, and filled with a terror I had spent years trying to forget existed. But I wasn't looking at the gun, I was on top of him. The man was frantic now. He clawed at my eyes, his fingernails digging into the skin of my forehead. I felt the warm trickle of blood start to move toward my eyelid, but I didn't blink. In a fight, pain is just information. It tells you where the enemy is. I captured his wrists, pinning them against the floor with a grip that had spent years hauling 60-pound rucksacks up the mountains of the Hindu Kush. "Stay down," I growled. My voice didn't sound like mine. It was a low, guttural rasp, the sound of the man I had spent 5 years pretending was dead. "Stay down, or I will end this right here." He didn't listen. They never do when they're in the middle of a psychotic break. He tried to buck me off, screaming something about the shadows and the voices. He was strong, the kind of strength that only comes from a brain that has bypassed its own safety limiters. He managed to heave his hips up, nearly tossing me toward the sharp corner of a metal medicine cart. I had to make a choice. To my left, I saw the double doors of the ward swing open. It was Larry, the security guard. He was 65 years old, overweight, and his hand was shaking so badly he couldn't even get his holster unclipped. Behind him were 2 other nurses, their faces pale masks of horror. They weren't seeing a hero, they were seeing a monster. They saw their quiet, unassuming co-worker, the guy who always helped them turn heavy patients, pinning a man to the floor with a look of predatory intensity that didn't belong in a house of healing. I saw the way Larry looked at me, the way he hesitated. He didn't know who to be more afraid of, the guy with the shotgun or the nurse who was currently dismantling him. "Miller," Larry stammered, his voice cracking. "Miller, stop, you're going to kill him." I ignored him. I had to. If I let go now, if I hesitated because of how I looked to them, this man would scramble for that shotgun and people would die. This is the controversy of the misfit warrior. People love the idea of protection until they see the violence required to provide it. They want the safety of the fortress, but they don't want to look at the blood on the walls. The gunman bit me, a hard, desperate chomp into the meat of my forearm. I felt his teeth sink through the scrub top and into my flesh. The nurse in me screamed about infection, about hepatitis, about rabies. The ranger in me didn't care. I used the pain to sharpen my focus. I shifted my weight, driving my knee into his solar plexus to knock the wind out of him, and then I transitioned into a textbook armbar. I felt the joint reach its limit. I felt the tendons straining. One more inch and his elbow would turn into a bag of wet glass. "Miller, don't." It was Sarah now. She had crawled out from behind the desk, her eyes wide as she looked at the blood on my face and the coldness in my eyes. "He's a patient, he's sick." "He's a threat," I barked back. The word patient didn't mean anything to me right then. In the Ranger Regiment, you simplify the world. There are targets and there are teammates. Right now, Sarah was a teammate who didn't understand the mission, and this man was a target that hadn't been fully neutralized. I looked down at the man beneath me. His eyes were rolled back, his face a bruised, bloody mess. He was sobbing now, the rage replaced by a hollow, pathetic whimpering. The threat was fading, but the adrenaline, the dark, intoxicating fire I had tried so hard to extinguish, was roaring through my system. For a heartbeat, I wanted to finish it. I wanted to hear that pop. I wanted to punish him for making me bring this version of myself back into the light. I wanted to punish him for ruining the lie I had lived so comfortably for 5 years. But then I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was light, trembling, but it felt like a lead weight. I looked up. It was Sarah. She wasn't looking at the gunman. She was looking at me, and in her eyes I didn't see gratitude. I didn't see relief. I saw fear. She was afraid of me. That was the moment the breach became permanent. I realized then that I could never go back to being Nurse Miller. I could never go back to the donuts and the quiet shifts and the invisible life. The gunman had stormed the ward with a shotgun, but it was my own reaction that had truly destroyed the sanctuary. I slowly released the pressure on his arm. I sat back on my haunches, my hands dripping with a mixture of my blood and his. I looked around the ward. The lights were still buzzing. The monitors were still beeping. The world was exactly the same, yet everything had changed. "Call 911, I said to Larry, my voice returning to its flat, monotone baseline. "And tell them we need a psych eval and a trauma team in the ICU." I stood up, my joints popping. I walked over to the shotgun, picked it up with 2 fingers by the trigger guard, and handed it to Larry. He took it like it was a live snake, his eyes never leaving mine. I walked past Sarah without looking at her. I went into the staff bathroom, turned on the cold water, and began to scrub the blood off my hands. I scrubbed until the skin was raw. I scrubbed until the water ran clear. But as I looked into the cracked mirror at the man with the bleeding forehead and the ranger's eyes, I knew. The hidden was no longer hidden. The war had found me again, and this time it wouldn't let go. The bathroom in the ICU was tiled in a shade of hospital beige that was meant to be calming but always felt like a funeral home. I leaned over the sink, watching the water swirl down the drain. It started deep crimson, then faded to a bruised pink, and finally turned clear. But even as the blood vanished, the tremors started. Not the tremors of fear. I hadn't felt that kind of fear since my first jump over Kandahar, but the tremors of a high-performance engine that had been redlined for too long. I looked in the mirror. My scrub top was torn at the shoulder, exposing the edge of a tattoo that most of my coworkers had never seen. It was the Ranger scroll, a black and tan reminder of a life lived in the shadows. I pulled the fabric back over it, but the secret was already out. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was an atmospheric shift. I could hear the muffled voices outside the door, the frantic whispers of nurses, the heavy tread of police boots, and the sharp, clipped tones of hospital administration. I walked out of the bathroom into a different world. The ICU was no longer a place of healing, it was a crime scene. Blue and red lights strobed against the windows, reflecting off the floor I had just fought on. The gunman was gone, loaded onto a gurney and whisked away to a secure wing, but the air still tasted like his desperation. A man in a sharp, charcoal-grey suit stood near the nurse's station. This was Mr. Henderson, the chief operating officer. He didn't look at the blood on the floor or the traumatized nurses sitting on the benches. He looked at me. He looked at me the way a homeowner looks at a termite infestation, as a liability that needed to be managed. "Miller," he said, his voice tight, "my office, now." We walked in silence. The hospital hallways felt longer than usual, the fluorescent lights more piercing. I could feel the eyes of the day shift staff, who were just arriving, boring into my back. News travels fast in a hospital. By now, I was either the hero who saved the ward or the loose cannon who almost beat a man to death. Henderson's office was filled with the smell of expensive leather and air-conditioned sterility. He sat behind his desk, leaning back, his hands steepled. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask about the bite mark on my arm or the gash on my forehead. "Do you have any idea," Henderson began, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "what the legal implications are for what happened tonight? We are a gun-free zone, Miller. We have protocols for active shooters. You are supposed to run, hide, fight in that specific order. You skipped the first two and went straight to destroy." I sat there, my spine straight, my hands resting flat on my knees. I didn't realize I was sitting in a modified, at ease position until I saw him glance at my posture. The gunman was 5 feet from a pregnant woman and a nurse with no exit, I said, my voice sounding like gravel hitting a tin roof. Running wasn't an option. Hiding would have been an invitation for him to start shooting. I did what was necessary to stabilize the situation. "Stabilize?" Henderson let out a dry, cynical laugh. "The police report says you used advanced combative techniques. The security footage shows you moving with a level of violence that is, frankly, terrifying. And then there's your file, or rather, the lack of it." He tossed a folder onto the desk. It was my employment application. "You listed your previous experience as security and logistics for a private firm," Henderson said. "You didn't mention the 75th Ranger Regiment. You didn't mention the Bronze Star. You didn't mention that you were trained by the United States government to be a professional soul collector." "I applied to be a nurse," I replied. "My military service wasn't relevant to my ability to administer medication or monitor vitals." "It's relevant when you turn my ICU into a cage match." Henderson slammed his hand on the desk. "The board is in a panic. The gunman's family is already calling about his rights. They're claiming he was having a mental health crisis and that you aggravated his condition with unnecessary force. Do you see the headline, Miller? Veteran nurse brutalizes mentally ill man. It doesn't matter that he had a shotgun. In this climate, you're the monster." This was the controversy. This was the part they don't tell you about when they talk about being a hero. In the civilian world, heroism is only acceptable if it's polite. If you save someone by pulling them out of a burning car, you're a saint. But if you save someone by using the skills you learned in a war zone, if you use the ugly kind of protection, you become a social pariah. "I won't apologize for keeping my team alive," I said. "Your team is terrified of you," Henderson leaned forward. "I spoke to Sarah. She's on mandatory leave. She said she didn't recognize you. She said the look in your eyes, it wasn't human. She's filing for a transfer. She doesn't feel safe working next to someone with your capabilities." That hit harder than the gunman's punch. Sarah, the girl I'd shared 1,000 quiet moments with, the one I'd protected, was now afraid of the very thing that kept her breathing. It was the classic soldier's dilemma. They want the wall, but they hate the man who guards it. "So what happens now?" I asked. "Now," Henderson sighed, "you are on administrative leave pending a full internal and legal investigation. The police want another statement. The lawyers want to vet your entire military history. And Miller, if I find one more thing you forgot to mention on your resume, you won't just be fired. I'll make sure you never hold a medical license in this country again." I stood up. I didn't say thank you. I didn't offer an excuse. I walked out of his office and back into the morning sun. The air was crisp and cold, a stark contrast to the stagnant heat of the hospital. I walked to my truck, my boots crunching on the gravel. As I sat in the driver's seat, I looked at my hands. They were still shaking, but it wasn't adrenaline anymore. It was the realization that I had spent 5 years building a house of cards, and one man with a shotgun had just blown it all down. I pulled out my phone. My social media was already blowing up. Someone, probably a visitor or a staff member, had leaked a snippet of the security footage. It was blurry, but you could see me. You could see the way I moved. The comments were a battlefield. "Give this man a medal," versus "He's a ticking time bomb," versus "Why is a trained killer working in a hospital?" I was no longer Nurse Miller. I was a controversial figure. I was a talking point for people who had never seen a gun in real life. I was a symbol of the dangerous veteran and the hidden hero all at once. I drove home to my small, quiet apartment, the place where I had tried to be a normal man. I sat on my couch in the dark, the silence of the room feeling heavier than the noise of the ward. I realized then that the transformation was complete. I couldn't go back to the stethoscope. The world knew what I was now. But as I looked at the news reports on the TV, seeing my own face staring back at me, I felt a strange, dark sense of relief. The lie was over. The ghost had been forced into the light. And if the world was going to call me a monster for saving lives, then maybe it was time I stopped trying to be a nurse and started being the man I was truly meant to be. The Ranger wasn't just back. He was in charge, and he had a lot to say about a world that wanted protection without the protector. The administrative leave didn't feel like a vacation. It felt like a house arrest in a world that had suddenly decided I was its favorite specimen to dissect. I spent the first 48 hours in my apartment with the blinds drawn, watching the digital version of my life spiral out of control. It's a strange thing to watch your soul become a trending topic. On one screen, I was a vigilante nurse who had bypassed the law. On another, I was a hero ranger who should be running for office. But in the eyes of the law, I was a variable they didn't know how to solve. The phone calls started on Thursday, not from friends. I didn't have many of those, but from lawyers, reporters, and veteran advocacy groups who wanted to use my face as a mascot for their specific brand of politics. I ignored them all until the knock came at my door. It wasn't the police, and it wasn't a process server. It was Sarah. She looked different without the scrubs. Smaller, more fragile. She stood on my doorstep with a folded newspaper in her hand and a look of profound guilt etched into her face. "I didn't mean what I said to Henderson," she whispered as I let her in. I was scared, Miller, not of you, but of what I saw. I've seen you help people for 2 years. I've seen you hold the hand of a dying man for 4 hours straight just so he wouldn't be alone. And then, in 5 seconds, I saw you become someone who looked like he could kill a man without blinking." "I did," I said, leaning against the kitchen counter. I didn't offer her coffee. I didn't offer her a seat. The nurse in me wanted to comfort her, but the Ranger was tired of apologizing for his nature. "The man you saw in the hallway didn't replace the man you know, Sarah. He's the one who makes the other one possible. You can't have the quiet night nurse without the soldier who knows how to keep the night quiet." "The hospital is going after your license," she said, her voice trembling. "Henderson is pushing the board to claim premeditated aggression. They're saying that because of your training, you didn't see a patient in crisis. You saw an enemy combatant. They're trying to say you're a danger to the medical profession because you can't switch it off." This was the tactical move the system uses against people like me. They don't attack your actions, they attack your programming. They try to make your greatest strength look like a psychological defect. The next morning, I was summoned to a preliminary review hearing. It wasn't a court of law, but it felt like an execution. The room was filled with suits, men and women who had spent their lives in climate-controlled offices, making decisions based on spreadsheets and risk mitigation strategies. Henderson sat at the head of the table, flanked by the hospital's lead counsel, a woman named Elena Vance, who looked like she'd been carved out of ice. "Mr. Miller," Vance began, her voice as sharp as a scalpel, "we have reviewed your military records, the ones we were finally able to pull from the Department of Defense. You were part of a direct action unit. Your primary training was in neutralizing high-value targets through overwhelming physical force. Is that correct?" "That is a simplified version of my training, yes," I replied. "And yet you chose to enter a profession built on the principle of first, do no harm," she continued, leaning forward. "Don't you see the inherent conflict there? How can a man trained to be a human weapon possibly function in an environment where the objective is to preserve life at all costs, even the life of an aggressor?" "Preserving life is exactly what I did," I said. "I preserved the life of the receptionist. I preserved the life of the charge nurse. I preserved the life of a woman in her third trimester. I even preserved the life of the gunman by stopping him before the police had to use lethal force." "By nearly crushing his larynx," Henderson interjected. "By breaking his nose and almost snapping his arm, that's your version of preservation." In a combat environment, and make no mistake, that hallway was a combat environment the moment he chambered a round, you don't have the luxury of proportional force. You use decisive force. You stop the threat until it is no longer a threat. Anything less is a gamble with the lives of everyone in that building. "And that," Vance said, turning to the board, "is precisely the problem. Mr. Miller still thinks he's in a war zone. He has brought the battlefield into the hospital. He sees threats where we see patients. He sees targets where we see human beings. This is not a man who belongs at a bedside." The room went silent. I could feel the weight of their judgment. To them, I was a relic of a world they preferred to ignore. I was the person they called when things went wrong globally, but I was the person they wanted to hide when things went right locally. But then, the doors at the back of the room opened. It wasn't a lawyer. It was a man in a wheelchair, pushed by a young woman. I recognized him instantly. It was Mr. Peterson from room 402, the old veteran who used to complain about the jello. He was wearing his old VFW cap, tilted slightly to the side. "I heard you were trying to hang this boy out to dry," Peterson rasped, his voice echoing in the sterile room. "Mr. Peterson, this is a private hearing," Henderson started, but Peterson cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "I was there," Peterson said. "I saw the whole thing from my doorway. I saw that kid with the gun. He was gonna kill us. I've seen that look before. I saw it in '68 in the Highlands. And I saw Miller. I saw him move. He didn't move like a man who wanted to kill. He moved like a man who was standing in the gap." Peterson looked at me, his old, watery eyes filled with a sudden, fierce clarity. "You people talk about protocols," Peterson spat at the board. "You talk about risk. But when that gun was pointed at us, none of your protocols were there. Miller was there. The Ranger was there. And if you take his license because he saved our lives the only way he knew how, then you might as well take mine too, because I wouldn't be here to complain about the food if it weren't for him." The board members looked at each other, shifted in their seats. The narrative was cracking. The victim wasn't just the gunman anymore. The victims were the people I had saved, and they were starting to speak up. "This doesn't change the fact that you lied on your application, Miller," Henderson said, his voice losing some of its edge. "I didn't lie," I said, standing up. "I just didn't think you'd understand, and based on this meeting, I was right. You want the safety I provide, but you're ashamed of the man who provides it. You want the peace, but you want to fire the peacemaker because he has scars on his knuckles." I walked toward the door, passing Peterson. I squeezed the old man's shoulder. "The tactical move isn't to fight you for this job," I said, looking back at Henderson. "I'm done being your invisible nurse. If this hospital doesn't want a man who can protect his patients, then this hospital doesn't deserve the patients it has." I walked out of that room with my head held high. I didn't know if I still had a career, and I didn't know if the legal battle was over. But as I stepped into the hallway, I saw a group of nurses, not just from my ward, but from all over the hospital, standing there in silence. They weren't looking at me with fear anymore. They were looking at me with respect. The controversy was no longer about whether I was a monster. It was about whether the system was brave enough to handle the truth. I had made my move. Now, it was time for the rest of the country to decide whose side they were really on. The walk from the hearing room to the hospital exit felt like the final scene of a movie, but there was no swelling soundtrack, only the heavy, rhythmic thud of my own boots on the linoleum. By the time I reached the glass double doors of the main entrance, the hospital incident had officially mutated into a national phenomenon. I pushed through the doors and was hit by a wall of light. It wasn't the sterile, humming glow of the ICU. It was the aggressive, flickering flash of a dozen news cameras. Microphones were thrust toward my face like bayonets. "Miller, are you being fired? Is it true you're a Black Ops operative? Do you have a message for the gunman's family?" I didn't stop. I moved through the crowd with the same clinical, crowd control gait I'd used in downtown Baghdad. I didn't see people, I saw obstacles. I saw potential threats. I saw a society that was obsessed with the spectacle of violence but allergic to its reality. I made it to my truck, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't go home. My apartment was likely already surrounded by investigative journalists looking through my trash for signs of PTSD. Instead, I drove to a small diner on the edge of the city, a place where the coffee was burnt and the people didn't care about the evening news. I sat in a corner booth, pulling up my phone. My face was everywhere, but the narrative had shifted. A hashtag was trending, Nurse Ranger. It started with a veteran in Ohio who posted a video saying, "Miller did what we were all trained to do. We don't stop being soldiers just because we put on a different shirt." Then came a nurse in California. "I work in an ER where we get assaulted every week, and management tells us to de-escalate with a smile. I wish Miller was on my shift." The controversy had hit a nerve. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the millions of people who worked in soft professions, nursing, teaching, social work, who felt abandoned by the systems that were supposed to protect them. It was about the misfits who were told to hide their strength until the exact moment that strength was needed to save a life. But then the counter-offensive began. A national news network brought on a behavioral analyst who looked like he hadn't seen the sun in a decade. "What we see in the Miller footage," the analyst said, his voice dripping with condescension, "is a classic case of combat carryover. This man didn't see a human being in distress. He saw a target. When we allow individuals with this level of desensitization into our hospitals, we are essentially inviting the wolf into the sheepfold." The tragedy isn't that he saved people. The tragedy is that he enjoyed the method. I stared at the screen, a cold smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. Enjoyed? They didn't understand. It wasn't joy. It was the relief of finally being allowed to be honest. It was the satisfaction of a tool finally being used for its intended purpose. My phone vibrated. It was a restricted number. Miller, the voice on the other end, was deep, gravelly, and instantly familiar. It was Colonel Vance, my old commanding officer from the 75th. I hadn't spoken to him since my discharge. "Sir," I said, my posture instinctively straightening in the booth. "I saw the tape, Miller. Nice takedown. Your footwork is getting a little sloppy, but that medical cart move, creative. The regiment is proud." "The hospital isn't, sir. They think I'm a monster." "Of course they do," Vance chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "They live in a world of cotton candy and safety scissors. They hate the fact that they need men like you. But listen, the reason I'm calling isn't to swap war stories. The network that's been trashing you, they just invited the victim's brother on for a live interview tonight. They're going to paint you as a bloodthirsty psycho who attacked a man seeking medical help. You need to get ahead of this." "I'm not a public speaker, sir. I'm a nurse, or I was." "You're a ranger, Miller, and right now your unit is under fire. You don't hide in a foxhole when your reputation is being flanked. You counterattack. There's a lawyer I know, one of ours. He's already on a plane. Meet him at the downtown Hilton in 2 hours. It's time to stop letting the suits tell your story." I hung up. I looked at my hands. The bite mark on my arm was purple and angry, a permanent souvenir of the night the lie died. 2 hours later, I was in a penthouse suite facing a man named Marcus Thorne. He didn't look like a lawyer. He looked like he could bench press a small car, and his suit cost more than my truck. He was an ex-JAG officer who specialized in difficult veteran cases. "Here's the deal, Miller," Thorne said, packing the room. "The hospital is going to offer you a settlement, a quiet resignation, a non-disclosure agreement, and a neutral reference. In exchange, you disappear. You take your nurse ranger fame and you go work at a private clinic in the middle of nowhere." "And if I don't?" "If you don't, they're going to release every disciplinary flag from your military file, including that incident in Gardez. They're going to frame you as a ticking time bomb who used a hospital as a personal shooting gallery. They're going to try to ruin you to save their own gun-free branding." "I don't care about the money," I said, "and I don't care about the reputation, but I won't let them say I did something wrong. I won't let them tell the other guys coming home that they have to be ashamed of what they can do." "Good," Thorne smiled. It was the smile of a shark, because I already booked us a slot on the biggest morning show in the country. We're not going to talk about protocols or hospital policy. We're going to talk about the truth. We're going to talk about why a society that trains its young men to be warriors is so terrified when those warriors actually show up. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the city lights. I thought about the gunman. I thought about the look in his eyes right before I hit him. He was a victim of a different kind of system, a system that had failed him long before he stepped into that ER. But failing him didn't give him the right to take Sarah or Mr. Peterson with him. The confrontation wasn't just in that hallway. It was here, in the heart of the country. The next morning, I stood in a green room at a television studio. A makeup artist tried to cover the gash on my forehead with foundation. "Leave it," I said, catching her wrist. "People need to see what safety actually looks like." I stepped onto the set. The bright lights were blinding, and the air was cold. The host, a woman with a perfectly coiffed bob and a practiced, concerned face, looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled disgust. "Joining us now is Miller, the so-called nurse ranger who is at the center of a national firestorm," she began, looking into the lens. "Miller, many people are calling you a hero, but many others are asking, did you have to be so violent? Was there no other way to help this troubled young man?" I looked directly into the camera. I didn't look at her. I looked at the millions of people sitting at their breakfast tables, the ones who felt the same misfit energy I did. "You want to know if there was another way?" I said, my voice steady and low. "In a perfect world, yes. In a world where mental health is prioritized, where veterans aren't discarded, and where security is more than a gun-free sticker on a glass door, maybe he wouldn't have been there. But we don't live in that world. We live in this one. And in this world, when a man with a shotgun points it at a nurse, you don't have a dialogue. You have a confrontation. And I'm not going to apologize for being the one who walked away from it." The studio went silent. I could see the producer behind the glass, frantically waving his hands. "But isn't it true," the host pressed, "that you were disciplined in the military for excessive aggression during an interrogation in Afghanistan? Doesn't that suggest a pattern? Doesn't that suggest you're just a man looking for a fight?" "I'm a man who knows what a fight looks like," I countered. "And because I know what it looks like, I'm the one who's best equipped to stop it. You people want the fruit of the tree, but you hate the roots. You want to feel safe in your hospitals, your schools, and your offices, but you want to banish the people who actually know how to provide that safety because we remind you that the world is a dangerous place." The interview went off the rails after that. Thorne leaned in, the host got defensive, and the segment ended with a heated exchange that would be clipped and shared 1,000,000 times by sunset. As I walked off the set, I felt a strange sense of peace. The nurse was gone, the secret was gone, there was only the truth now. I walked out of the studio and into the crowded street. For the first time, I didn't try to hide. I didn't pull my hat down. I walked with my head up. A man in a business suit stopped me. He looked at my face, then at the scar on my neck. He didn't ask for an autograph. He just nodded, a short, sharp, respectful tilt of the head. "Thanks for standing your ground, Sarge," he whispered. The confrontation wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting for a country or a hospital. I was fighting for myself, and I was winning. The media storm didn't just pass, it transformed into a legal hurricane. After that live interview, the hospital's legal team stopped sending emails and started sending subpoenas. They weren't just looking to fire me anymore, they were looking to erase me. If they could prove I was a predisposed aggressor, they could shift the entire liability of the shooting onto my shoulders. They wanted to tell the world that the gunman didn't cause the trauma, I did. I spent 3 weeks in a grey-walled deposition room, sitting across from Elena Vance. The air in those rooms is thick with the smell of stale coffee and expensive toner. Every word I spoke was recorded, transcribed, and scrutinized for a hint of the monster they were so desperate to find. "Mr. Miller," Vance said, tapping a pen against a thick stack of medical records. "We have testimony from 3 nurses who claim that after you neutralized the suspect, you didn't immediately begin life-saving measures on him. They say you stood over him for precisely 12 seconds, just watching him bleed. What were you doing in those 12 seconds?" "I was assessing the perimeter," I said. My voice was a dead calm. "I was ensuring there wasn't a second shooter. I was checking my own body for wounds I might not have felt due to adrenaline. And I was waiting for my heart rate to drop so I didn't accidentally kill him while trying to help him. It's called tactical pause. It's the difference between a professional and a panicked amateur." "Or," she countered, leaning in until I could see the reflection of the fluorescent lights in her pupils, "were you enjoying the sight of your enemy defeated? Were you relishing the fact that you had finally found a way to bring the war home?" I looked at the court reporter, then back at her. "I've seen enough war to last 10 lifetimes, counselor. No one who has actually been in it relishes it. But I do relish the fact that Sarah is alive to tell you how scary I looked. I relish that Mr. Peterson is still complaining about his jello. If those 12 seconds of silence make me a villain in your eyes, I can live with that, because their silence would have been permanent if I hadn't acted." The revelation didn't come from the lawyers, though. It came from a man I never expected to see again. On the final day of the deposition, a man walked into the lobby of the law firm. He was leaning heavily on a cane, his arm in a sling, his face still mapped with the yellowish-purple bruises of a healing fracture. It was the gunman. The room went dead silent. The lawyers scrambled, security tensed up, but he wasn't there with a weapon, he was there with a letter. His name was Elias. He was 22 years old. He was a former foster kid who had aged out of the system, gotten hooked on prescriptions after a warehouse injury, and had fallen through every single crack in the American floorboards. He looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't see a target. I saw the wreckage of a life. "They want me to testify against you," Elias said, his voice shaky and thin. "The hospital lawyers, they came to my room. They said if I told the judge you enjoyed hurting me, they'd help me get a lighter sentence. They said you were a trained killer who took advantage of my mental state." Vance stood up, her face turning a vivid shade of red. "Mr. Miller's counsel, this is highly irregular. This witness should not be here." "Let him speak," Thorne growled, stepping in front of her like a shield. Elias looked at me and I saw tears welling in his eyes. "I remember that night. Most of it is a blur of the hunger and the pills, but I remember your eyes, man. You weren't angry, you were just there. You were the only thing in my life that actually stopped me. Everyone else just let me slide deeper into the hole. You hit me, yeah, you broke my nose, but when you held me down, you whispered to me. Do you remember what you said?" The room went still. I remembered. "I told you to breathe," I whispered. "I told you that as long as you were breathing, the war wasn't over." "Yeah," Elias nodded, a single tear tracking through the bruising on his cheek. "You called me soldier. You treated me like I was worth fighting, not just worth ignoring. I told the lawyers to go to hell. I'm pleading guilty. I'm taking the time, but I wanted you to know. You didn't bring the war to the hospital. You brought the truth. I was already at war. You're just the only one who noticed." He turned and limped out of the room, leaving a vacuum of silence behind him. The deposition ended that day. The hospital's case collapsed. They couldn't sue a hero when the victim refused to be one, but the victory felt hollow. I had won the legal battle, but I had lost my life. My license was under review indefinitely. My reputation was a polarized mess. I was a man without a country, a nurse without a ward. I went back to the hospital one last time to clear out my locker. It was too 00 a.m. my old shift. The hallways were quiet, the air smelling of floor wax and lavender-scented disinfectant. I reached my locker, pulled out my extra pair of clogs and my stethoscope. I looked at the stethoscope. It felt light, flimsy, like a toy. Miller. I turned. It was Sarah. She was back from her leave. She looked tired, the dark circles under her eyes matching the ones I'd been sporting for weeks. "I'm leaving, Sarah," I said. "I know," she said, walking up to me. She didn't stay 6 feet away this time. She stood right in front of me. "I wanted to say thank you, and I'm sorry. I was scared because I didn't understand. I thought you were hiding a monster. I realize now you were just holding a shield." "It's a heavy shield to hold in a place like this," I said, leaning against the cold metal lockers. "People here want to believe that the world is soft. They want to believe that if they're kind enough, the shadows won't come for them. I can't be the guy who reminds them otherwise every night. It's not fair to them, and it's not fair to me." "Where will you go?" "There are other places that need shields," I said. "Places where the misfit is the only one who can survive. I spent 5 years trying to be normal, Sarah, but normal is a luxury I don't think I'm allowed to have. I'm going to find the others. The guys like me who are hiding in plain sight, trying to pretend their hands don't know how to do what mine did." I handed her my stethoscope. "Give this to the new hire. Tell them to listen closely. Sometimes the heart skips a beat because it's sick. Sometimes it skips a beat because it's waiting for a hero." I walked out of the ICU, past the nurse's station, and past the spot on the floor where I had dismantled Elia's. The hospital had scrubbed the blood away, but I could still see the ghost of the struggle. I realized then that I wasn't leaving because I was forced out. I was leaving because I had outgrown the disguise. The revelation wasn't that I was a ranger. The revelation was that I didn't need to be a nurse to save people. As I reached the parking lot, I saw a black SUV waiting for me. Marcus Thorne was leaning against the hood, a thick envelope in his hand. "The board settled," he said, handing me the envelope. "Full back pay, a public apology, which they'll bury on page 10, and a letter of commendation for your file. You're a free man, Miller. You can go back to nursing anywhere in the state." I looked at the hospital, the glowing red emergency sign reflecting in the windows. "No," I said, tossing the envelope onto the passenger seat of my truck. "I'm done with the wards. I've got a different manifesto to write now." Thorne grinned. "I figured you'd say that. My contact in the State Department is looking for consultants for a new veteran reintegration program. They need someone who isn't afraid to tell the truth about what it's like to come home. Someone who can bridge the gap between the scrub and the suit." I looked at the scar on my arm, the one Elias had given me. It wasn't an injury anymore. It was a badge. "Tell them I'm interested," I said, "but tell them I don't work in the shadows anymore. If I'm doing this, I'm doing it loud. The world needs to know that the misfits aren't the problem. We're the only ones who know how to solve it." I drove away from the hospital, the sun beginning to peek over the horizon. The night was over, but for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't tired. I was awake. The hidden was no more. The warrior was home. The engine of my truck hummed a steady, low-frequency song as the city skyline faded into the rearview mirror. I wasn't just driving away from a job or a legal mess. I was driving away from a version of myself that had been built on a foundation of apology. For 5 years, I had apologized for my volume, for my intensity, and for the jagged edges of my history. I had tried to be the safe veteran, the one who doesn't talk about the noise, the one who fits neatly into a cubicle or a hospital ward. But as the sun crested over the highway, painting the American landscape in shades of bruised orange and defiant gold, I realized that the greatest disservice I ever did to my country was trying to blend in. Listen to me closely, because this is the part they won't put in the recruitment brochures, and they definitely won't teach it in your HR orientation. We live in a culture that is obsessed with normalcy. We are told from the time we're in grade school to color within the lines, to lower our voices, and to smooth out the parts of our personality that make others uncomfortable. We are taught that strength is something to be feared unless it's wrapped in a uniform and kept at a distance. But what happens when the lines vanish? What happens when the civilized world stops being civilized at 2:14 on a Tuesday morning? When that gunman walked onto my ward, he didn't care about my bedside manner. He didn't care about my nursing credentials. He cared about power. And the only thing that stopped him wasn't a policy, it was a person. A person who had been told he was too much, too intense, and too broken. This is the Misfits Manifesto. If you are watching this and you feel like you don't fit the mold, if you're a veteran who feels like a ghost in a suit, a survivor who carries a fire no one else can see, or just a screw-up who has always been told your edges are too sharp, I have a message for you. Your edges are exactly what the world needs to cut through the lies. We are the sheepdogs who have been told to act like sheep. We've been conditioned to feel guilty for our instincts. We've been shamed for our pasts. But your past isn't a prison, it's a forge. Every scar you carry, every traumatic night you survived, and every controversial decision you've made has prepared you for a moment that hasn't happened yet. The system wants you quiet because a quiet person is a predictable person. They want you hidden because they don't know how to categorize the warrior in the garden. But when the garden is under attack, they'll be looking for you. And when they do, you need to be ready to stand up, not as a victim of your history, but as its master. I'm standing here today not because I'm a hero, but because I stopped being a liar. I stopped lying to myself that I could be just a nurse. I am a ranger. I am a healer. I am a man who knows how to break bones and how to mend spirits, and I refuse to choose between them anymore. To my brothers and sisters in the United States, especially those who have served, stop dimming your light to make others comfortable. Stop apologizing for the skills that kept you alive. This country was built by misfits. It was built by people who were too stubborn to quit and too unstable to follow the rules of a king. We are the descendants of rebels, and it is time we started acting like it. If you're a nurse, be the best nurse they've ever seen, but keep your eyes on the door. If you're a teacher, protect your students with everything you have. If you're a father or a mother, teach your children that it's okay to be strong, it's okay to be different, and it's okay to be the person who steps up when everyone else steps back. The hospital tried to take my license. They tried to take my voice, but they only gave me a bigger stage. I'm moving forward now to build a network for people like us, a place where your checkered past is considered a qualification, not a disqualification. We're going to bridge the gap between the battlefield and the boardroom. We're going to show this world that the dangerous man is the one you want guarding your children's future. So here is your call to action. Don't just like this video, don't just share it. I want you to look in the mirror today and identify that one part of yourself you've been hiding because you were afraid it was too much. I want you to embrace it, I want you to own it, and I want you to use it to help someone who can't help themselves. The night nurse is gone, the ranger is here, and I'm looking for a few good misfits to help me change the world. If you're ready to stop hiding, leave a comment below with your hidden strength. Tell me what you bring to the table that the world is afraid of. I'm reading every single one, because the next time the shadows come, I want to know exactly who is standing in the gap with me. Subscribe, join the manifesto, and for God's sake, stay sharp. Because the world is a beautiful, dangerous, controversial place, and it's a whole lot safer when people like us are awake.